This is Taya Graham reporting for the Real News Network. I'm here in front of the Mitchell Courthouse awaiting the motions that are first being argued by the lawyers in the Freddie Gray case, who died at the hands of 6 police officers while in police custody. I'm here with Paul Jace, senior editor of the Real News Network. Hi, welcome, Paul. Thank you. What I want to know is, what do you think some of the implications might be of this Freddie Gray case? What do you think how the city's reacting to the case, whether or not you see more possibility of uprising?
Well, let me start by saying that this is nothing new. The police abuse, systemic police abuse, has been going on for 50, 60 years or maybe longer in Baltimore. There have been people killed by police often over the years. The reason this has become such an issue, I guess, is probably because it was caught on videotape. As we've seen in other parts of the country, when it goes public, you can actually see it. But it's a tip of the iceberg. But well, we're hearing a big siren, which is part of living in Baltimore. You get used to sirens. So
and helicopters, also helicopters.
Helicopters, yeah. This one's an ambulance going by, but we're standing right next to a bunch of hospitals, so that may be why. But what isn't being asked in the media very often is, why is there systemic police abuse? You get the odd reference to poverty. But the connection between poverty and police abuse is not normally drawn, because the next question has to be asked: why, since about the 1950s in Baltimore, have you had whole areas of communities that were vibrant communities where people had jobs, there were grocery stores, there was cafes, there was a real life, how those communities have been destroyed, and not just recently. The destruction begins around the end of the 1950s into the 1960s. And one failed policy after another has not changed the situation. So it's a complex set of issues, but the role of police in all this is to keep a lid on poor people. Because if people are living in desperate conditions, they will fight back desperately, sometimes self-destructively. You know, the murder rate in Baltimore, most of the people that are getting killed are poor black people. In fact, it's one of the safest cities in America if you're white. It's like, I think last year was about 240 murders, and I think 11 were white people. So this is poor people, poor black people in a desperate situation with their families being destroyed. To a large extent, in fact, if you ask people in these areas what is the number one thing, the answer is always jobs. Lack of being able to make a dignified living. So the role of the police, and it's not just about bad police and bad apple police, even the good cops, they're being asked to enforce laws, and these laws reinforce a whole set of social, economic, and political relations that are based on, some people have enormous wealth, and a lot of people are living in utter poverty. And even the people that aren't living in utter poverty, a large section of Baltimore go to work every morning. Sometimes they go to work again in a second job, and they're making $8 and $9 an hour trying to support 3 or 4 kids. I've been telling this story about somebody we interviewed at Johns Hopkins who was on strike a few months ago. This guy cleans surgical rooms at Johns Hopkins. He has to take special drugs because he's cleaning up blood and guts. He has to take special drugs to avoid getting HIV. He's been doing this for 14 years. 14 years of seniority. He's making $13 an hour. Yeah, oh my gosh. So why is he doing the job? Because unemployment is so high. People are desperate for jobs. And if you're desperate, you take what you can get. In fact, $13 an hour is actually considered a good pay in Baltimore for most people. Never mind, how ridiculous it is after 14 years of work. So the high unemployment is advantageous to people who are hiring people. So this idea of having a big pool of unemployed people, it's very good if you happen to own a business, or you're running a big hospital or a pharma sector, and you can make your cleaning staff bear the brunt. The other thing is, people are speculating like crazy on real estate. All the government schemes to get rid of poverty have thrown money, which essentially, sometimes it's programs so people can buy houses. In fact, the whole subprime mortgage fiasco that helped trigger the crash in 07, 08, it was invented in Baltimore in the 1990s. The number one cause of foreclosures in Baltimore in the year 2000 was subprime mortgage foreclosures. deliberately targeting African Americans. In fact, the city wound up suing Wells Fargo and a couple of other banks, and in the lawsuit, some of the emails came out, and outright Ku Klux Klan racist language amongst the Wells Fargo people who were selling these mortgages to people. So what's the role of police in all this? Society, I put it in quotation marks because it's really, the top percentile who actually own stuff that really have the influence on what kind of laws get passed. But the kind of laws that get passed reinforce these economic, social, political relations where people can live in half a century and more and no end in sight of desperate poverty. So then you say, police enforce these laws. And I've asked the cop, what do you think of all this abuse and what's going on? His answer, I thought, was pretty good. He said, well, what do you want us to be? You want us to be the hammer, or you want us to hand out flowers? Now, we know there is somewhere in between there.
There has to be somewhere in between.
But the truth is, the laws, the people that really have political power in the country, they fundamentally want the police to be the hammer. Because the only way to really solve chronic poverty is to have a kind of public policy that they don't want. First of all, higher taxes on wealthy people. But even more importantly, it's really clear from decades and decades of public policy of supposedly investing in the downtown harbor was going to revitalize Baltimore and solve the problem of poverty. Well, a lot of developers and hotels and now casinos have made money out of that development. Very, very little has trickled in. In fact, there's pretty good evidence, we're looking into it now, that more public money has gone into that development than tax money came out. So, and it certainly has had next to no effect on the school system falling apart. In fact, the number of neighborhoods in poverty has grown exponentially, even since all this inner harbor development. Even some of the other policies, like subprime was one. There's been other get people to own a home program. It caused a flurry of real estate. Real estate values go up. Well, they go up because, and speculators are the ones that have already bought the stuff. So they're cashing in on this. Public money goes in. It looks nice. Oh, you're going to help people buy houses. Really what happens is people wind up buying houses they can't afford. So they get a little real estate bubble going. And eventually they get foreclosed anyway and they lose their houses. And then the neighborhood's right back where it was before. So again, police are being asked to reinforce these relationships. And so police abuse is actually built in to what I say we. We're not, if it was up to us, we wouldn't have this kind of society or this kind of police force. So I'll say they. What they're trying to do in terms of maintaining the status quo in the society. So why is the DOJ worried? Why is the Department of Justice coming in to investigate Baltimore Police Force? Why does Marilyn Mosby finally actually charge some cops? I'm not saying finally for her, but finally a state's attorney actually charges cops. It's not good for the system for the abuse to go too far, partly in the realm of day of cameras.
So this is a way of putting a lid on it, essentially. So just like you could say charitable operations of people like Warren Buffett simply are a way of giving just enough back to prevent people from being radicalized, from keeping the poor from actually uprising. So you're saying it's similar, that here it's just an action just to keep the lid on things, to keep the poor from going together in solidarity and uprising, essentially.
Yeah, I think when the abuse gets too overt and it's caught on camera, it's a very radicalizing effect on people. And they don't want the abuse to get so far. So when some cops cross a certain line, they do want to pull it back, but it's a balancing act for them because they don't want to send a message to the police, don't be the hammer.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Thank you so much, Paul J. We really appreciate it. This is Taya Graham, Stephen Janis, and Megan Sherman in front for the Real News Network at City Hall.